Are you tired of feeling stuck, blaming circumstances or others for where you are in life? It's time for some hard truths that might just be the wake-up call you need. Welcome to our latest episode, where we dive deep into the essence of personal responsibility and how it's the cornerstone of real, lasting change. Today, I'm joined by Greg, whose extensive experience in the high-stakes world of aviation and personal discipline sheds light on what it truly means to take control of your life's direction. Today, we'll confront the common excuses that hold us back, dissect the victim mentality that keeps us trapped, and most importantly, provide you with a tangible framework for change. This isn't about subtle shifts. We're talking about equipping you with the tools to make significant changes in your life. So if you're ready to be seen, called out, but ultimately transformed, this episode is for you. Stay tuned as we navigate the journey of responsibility together, ensuring that by the end of this podcast episode, you'll be ready to pilot your life towards the destination you truly deserve. Let's get started. Thank you for joining me on the Self-Reflections podcast. I'm your host, Klaudia Gebert. Today with me, we have Greg. Hi, Greg. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Klaudia. It's great to be here. I was really excited to be on this podcast with you today.
We finally got here. It's been a little while of us planning and double checking our schedules and seeing whether or not we can actually connect. So it's really lovely to finally do a guest appearance, and you are my first guest appearance.
Yes.
Yay, congratulations.
Thank you.
So Greg, the audience knows me well by now. I have shared a few details about my life. Greg, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my family and I migrated to Australia when I was very young, coming from a family which taught values such as discipline, motivation. I was introduced to a variety of different sports from a young age. One of those sports which I progressed all the way through to my early teens was martial arts. That led through to getting involved in the fitness industry as well. We trained, my siblings and I, in martial arts competitively. And once I left school, I pursued a career in aviation, which required an extensive amount of training to become an airline pilot. That allowed me to work in areas of business management, training, assessing, and today I find myself as an international pilot for a large international airline.
Before we move on, do you enjoy, I guess, where you're at the moment? You have achieved so much in your life. Is it something that really resonates and brings you joy?
Absolutely. I don't consider it work. When I sit there and look out the window and realize I get paid for it, it's fantastic. I used to get kicked out of class when I was young doing that. So no, I love it. It's a fantastic job. It comes with its challenges because we're constantly given training, assessments. We are constantly studying. It is a high-paced, complex environment that we work in, so that's certainly a challenging role to be in. But the part which I enjoy the most is the fact that I'm constantly receiving critique, feedback for what I'm doing, trying to better what we do. And as they always say, safety is the number one priority, and I guess this is why we get that kind of feedback and critique. So it certainly allows me to grow as a person myself.
You mentioned that through your experience as an airline pilot, you get regular feedback. So given you're someone who does take feedback very well, and that's why I invited you on this podcast and to discuss this topic, you regularly ditch excuses, you take on feedback and critique very well. How has your character developed over time? Do you think you were born with these traits?
I certainly wasn't born with that. I think it's something that you learn through the environment that you are in. It certainly wasn't the case when I was younger, having the experience of the rigorous training throughout martial arts, and then later on when I did pursue the career as a pilot, I had the same traits that everybody else has in society, which is my ego kicked in every single time I received feedback for something that I should be doing either different or better. It wasn't until I started working as an instructor myself within the aviation or airline environment where I started noticing that all the trainees or students that I had were making excuses the same way I was. Now, throughout training in martial arts, I noticed kids didn't make excuses. When you tell a kid they're doing something slightly different, they're very honest and they ask you, what am I doing wrong? Whereas what I found from my own trainees and students was that they did make excuses. So that was when I actually reflected on myself and asked, well, hang on a minute. Do I do those same excuses as well? And the reality was the answer was yes.
How old were you when you did that self-reflective practice to assess whether it's something that you do engage in as well?
It was my early 20s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd gone through all my teenage years and those early 20s years allowing my ego to take control.
You mentioned that there is a significant difference between kids taking responsibility and adults taking responsibility. I can confirm, even through my experience, that working with adults, in the past I have worked with adolescents and young people. It is a lot easier for young people to take on that feedback, especially if it's coming from a good place.
Yeah.
They're so much more willing to grow and take it on and better themselves. We very much as adults get stuck in, like you've identified, that ego part of us. And it is a very learnt behavior. I think as we are exposed to other adults around us growing up, we start noticing how those around us take responsibility or reject it or use excuses. And naturally, as kids, we then develop that own inner dialogue that creates our own narrative that I don't need to, take responsibility. I can blame it on everything and anything. And it's a mimicked behavior, isn't it?
It is. It's directly proportional to the environment that you are in. If everybody around you is doing exactly that, that is what you learn. That is the learnt behavior. And it is what you take on. And essentially, like a chameleon, you adapt the same traits. And it's easy. It's something that I found personally was always easier to go down the road of following what I had learnt in my environment than it was to step outside that square and take the risk of doing something slightly different.
And I think on reflection of how I developed as well, there was a very, very significant part of my life where I didn't like taking feedback or critique. And that's my own inner dialogue of, the impacts of perfection and wanting to do things right and well. And as a child, that doesn't matter. You don't actually care as a child as much. You're just free and enjoying the world, and you hope that everybody loves you.
You don't have a filter as a child.
Not at all. So then when you grow up and start to notice the world, we become very egocentric. And it then develops into this dialogue of, oh, but what will people truly think of me? And do I then need to be better? And, oh no, I can't let people think poorly of me. So we fall into the trap of rejecting people when they do try and give us feedback, because it really instigates these ideas of, I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm not enough. And we want to protect that as much as possible. So it makes sense where you were able to identify that through your experience with children at martial arts to then students within the airline industry, that it's chalk and cheese. You said that in your 20s you had a bit of a revelation because you reflected from what was happening in your environment. What did you do then after you realized what you were doing?
Initially, it was, taking responsibility, identifying that I was making excuses. And then I started to apply a trial and error of techniques on myself, initially to my professional career. And then once I noticed that that was actually helping and working, I started to apply it to my everyday life. So I started making small changes, seeing if those excuses were disappearing, and continued to work on that.
Do you think you've perfected it?
Absolutely not. It's a daily practice. The changes I make throughout my life are constantly being tweaked. Just like what the environment promotes, the ego will always come back.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of understanding that and applying those small techniques as you develop to essentially completely remove those excuses from your life.
And what you've described there is that you're beautifully human. And from my personal experience as well, there are still feedback and critique I receive that still jars me, and I have a reaction. And it is about the regular practice of making those changes and growing as an individual. But it does take practice, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, I released an episode on the ego and victim mentality. It explored how easy it is for us to get stuck in victimizing ourselves, blaming external factors, really, really getting stuck in that narrative and rejecting any form of feedback or critique as a form of growth. It's not uncommon, even in my clinical practice, for me to see that with clients. At first, I do have to build the relationship of trust to be able to gently give feedback in a really constructive way. But what I notice is the first instinct is to just rebut that and reject it and not take that responsibility. Do you think it's a common experience for everyone from your history?
From a training and assessment point of view, especially in the environment which is high functioning, complex training environment that the airlines require you to go through, I would say at least 90% of people I have worked with use excuses.
Wow, that's a lot.
And I'm talking excuses like your external factors. So, the weather, the wind, rain, snowy conditions, to other people, the person sitting next to you or the person they spoke to 5 seconds ago, or air traffic control, for example. The equipment, so, the aircraft, my seat wasn't set correctly today. And the funniest one I've heard was my shoes were slippery and hence why that occurred. So, yeah, from a clinical perspective, though, what kind of excuses would you hear most commonly?
I think it's not me. It's their fault. That kind of redirection of blame is very, very common. It's the rejection of owning some of that responsibility. And that might be for various reasons. It might be because of avoidance. It might be because there is fear that's driving that. So some individuals that might suffer with imperfection or fear of failure or think that they've got flaws or there is some segment of them that are defective, they will reject because of the amount of fear that they experience. It's quite easy for individuals to get stuck, like I mentioned before, in that egocentric and victim mentality. It's that I have been wronged. It's really hard for me to then take that on because well, this is what I explain to my clients. If we take on certain feedback or critique that goes against, I guess, some of these narratives that we want to keep, that we want to strive for perfection, and if someone gives us feedback or critique, it's as if it's completely shattering that. So I find in my experiences with clients that fear factor and that avoidance and the external blame is probably the most common that I experience.
Yeah.
From your experience, Greg, why do people you have been exposed to choose to use excuses?
You mentioned earlier the egocentric person or character that comes out. I don't always think that's the case in all situations, only because I think making excuses is easy. It's a learned behavior. It is something that is comfortable. You have developed this from the environment. Your parents might have done it. Your siblings may have done it. You've got a number of comfort levels that will start to slide into whatever situation you're in as a result of those excuses.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the reasons vary,
Mm.
but ultimately I think it's just easy.
Mm. And automatic.
Yes, absolutely.
When we look at our neural pathways, it's habitual, it's automatic. Like you said, it's easy. Our brain is wired that way. It doesn't mean that it can't be rewired at any age, as evidence shows that our brains can be rewired at any age whatsoever. So I think it's very easy for us to fall into the trap of, oh, okay, but that's easy for me to do. It just happens. And that's something I catch so often with my clients, where nothing just happens. And we try and unpack that really, really gently to be able to help clients understand what has happened. And when we then build that awareness around the slip that we take into what is easy or automatic, we then realize, oh, I do that. And then we're able to make the change. Greg, let's move on to the consequences of making excuses. What have you personally and professionally found as the consequences of using excuses?
Well, personally, the excuses just allow the issue to keep coming back up, which is quite frustrating because you are trying to do new things. You are trying to change whatever situation you're in and notice that you're not making any change.
Mm-hmm.
Professionally, well, progress stagnates. And that's the biggest one I've seen, where trying to apply changes is really not doing anything because you're trying to change external factors. Now, you can't control the weather, so there's no way you can change the wind and how it's going to react every time you are doing a particular thing. So I think the biggest issue with having and making excuses is essentially you don't progress.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies to every day-to-day life, like a relationship. It's really easy to blame your partner for everything that's coming up in your life, or you can blame your boss. But the reality is, unless you start looking at what the common denominator is in all of these issues that do come up, the issues are just going to keep repeating themselves, or at the very least, your progress will just plateau.
Clinically, I see a diminition of confidence, self-esteem. We see mood changes, increase in anxiety, self-doubt, of course, imposter syndrome, which I think I did an episode on the other week. Very, very strong ego and victim mentality. But overall, I see people suffering. They're stuck in that, and they very much become very pessimistic, and it's hard for them to shift and be able to start then moving into a state of responsibility and then change. We're not here saying that it's all your fault. We're here kind of identifying that one has to be taking responsibility, and it's a shared responsibility where it's not just the other person. It's partially elsewhere and it's also partially you, but that you part has to be taken. But I think, while we think it's an easy way out to constantly be using excuses and not taking that responsibility, we can identify from, your experiences and my experiences clinically that it's never going to be an easy way out. The consequences are always going to be so much more dire and challenging, and it will then impact your progress, not just professionally, but very much personally. And then if we look at mentally, it's a big price that we pay for continuing to use excuses.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. In my clinical journey with clients, like I mentioned, establish a really good rapport and a therapeutic relationship before I give them some hard truths. I don't just rip clients apart when they first come to see me, otherwise no one will stay. The therapeutic framework has to be really safe and nurturing, and like I said, that relationship has to be established. Once that is, and I'm able to not beat around the bush and really call clients out, they already have a framework of understanding of why they do things that they do, and be able to understand what coping mechanisms they might fall into as a means of using those excuses. Once clients are able to see that, take a step back and see that, and then catch themselves out when they are actually about to or have made excuses, them understanding that and knowing where it's coming from and having something to replace it with creates beautiful change for them. And I often find that it's quite a pivotal point in therapy where they feel really empowered and they feel like they're able to continuously be creating change within themselves. Is that something that you see within your experience as well?
Well, that's actually something I experienced myself.
Yes.
When I came to that realization that I was sharing the exact same traits as everyone that I was training at the time. So I absolutely see that and have experienced that in my situation throughout the airline training and assessing ventures that I've experienced. Because the interesting point is when you really look at what the issue
or the underlying factor
is, it is always you.
Yeah.
And essentially you are the common denominator in whatever issue it is that you're trying to look at, or at the very least resolve.
Mm-hmm.
And once you understand that, or at the very least accept that, that's where true change begins, internally and externally.
Kind of like the first step, isn't it?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. That ownership, accountability, and I guess, that responsibility. Mm-hmm.
I've had it with trainees or students where the moment I ask to really dissect whatever it is that we're talking about, and that moment of realization that they've played a major part of what then conspired to an issue,
Mm-hmm.
that's where the real change starts.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we can actually break it down. We actually talk about what areas we can improve on, what areas we'll certainly not do next time.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find is that's where the dramatic change occurs in their own progress, which is exactly what I experienced myself.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, quite a hard truth. Like, it's really you. You know, you are fully or partially responsible, and you need to take that ownership. And for some, that's going to be a very hard pill to swallow. I know throughout my experience, there are times where I wanted to reject that and run away from all responsibility.
Yeah.
But if you are noticing that this is activating you, this is exactly the episode for you, because it then allows you to reflect on, well, what's that resistance that you are experiencing? Where is that coming from? And are you ready to actually avoid running away from this? Are you willing to face it? Are you ready to kind of, how do I say it, get more comfortable with the uncomfortable? And that's the pivotal thing, right? It's hard to make changes like this, and it's hard to put your hand up to be like, okay, this was all me or partially me. It is a really hard challenge. And if it is bringing something up in you, keep watching. We will, of course, continue to explore how you can take ownership in a way that's not so overwhelming, and it can actually lead to profound change. I guess that's why we're doing this episode, not just to point the finger at you to say you're the problem. We are here, all of us, separately taking ownership and responsibility and being able to guide each other on how you can actually be a better individual for the sake of your health and then the relationships that you have in your life. Greg, what does ownership and accountability look like and sound like to you?
Well, I just think back to the last time I was in this situation, just owning it.
Mm-hmm.
I did it. Or I genuinely did not know.
Mm-hmm.
Or at the very least, I did not read that part of the textbook.
Or have the knowledge, or potentially have made a mistake, a genuine mistake.
Exactly.
I find it diffuses the situation very quickly when you do that, both in you and the other person too.
Well, initially it opens you up to, well, what was it? Rather than just, how can I get around this situation?
Taking ownership and accountability is naturally going to feel very uncomfortable. We avoid it like the plague. But it does mean that there is an opportunity for growth there.
Certainly is. If you just take a moment as an example and think about the last situation you had where you had a disagreement with somebody. And I just want you to think you were the one in the wrong, whether that's true or not.
I'm already activating.
Straight away, your mind goes into defense to say, well, hang on a minute. It was them. It wasn't me. It was certainly them. Just accept that it was you for a moment. It's uncomfortable. It really is. But by doing that, what you do is straight away activate those neural pathways in the brain, which is what starts to activate change. Because it then starts creating questions. Well, if it was me, then what did I do? Or hang on, have I done that before? Could I do it differently next time?
And of course, in the moment, you might not be able to do it because we're all emotionally charged, but it is then afterwards taking a moment of reflection of, okay, well, what did that feel like for me? Did I step into reaction rather than reflection? Did I then diffuse the situation in a way where I could have taken joint responsibility with somebody? And from there, you're actively rewiring your brain to do something different. And the more we practice doing that, even after the situation has happened, so no matter how long after a disagreement or something going wrong, using reflective practice helps rewire the brain. So it doesn't always have to happen in the moment. Don't feel pressured that in these early stages, when you're activated, you have to, I have to think of this strategy and that strategy. No, it's afterwards, apply some reflective practice and be able to reassess, well, what happened there for me? How was I reactive? What could I do differently? What can I own and be responsible for? And how do I come back to repair what had happened in a way where it's shared?
That's right.
How do you think that would then teach students, for example, because you mentioned your history before with aviation students, how do you think that would have then helped them better their experience in learning the aircraft, for example?
Well, one example is we are constantly put through different training and assessing situations in simulators. On a regular basis, we get put in a simulator. We get the experience of having emergency situations play out in real time. So everything is happening the way you would see it happen in a real airplane. So for example, your heart rate increases, the adrenaline kicks in, the fight or flight response happens. It is during the debriefing aspect of it. Naturally, in the scenario itself, yes, your emotion is going to kick in. You're going to react automatically. Your motor memory skills are going to kick in. You're going to do everything you've been trained to do, which is exactly how you would handle every day-to-day situation. If you get in an argument with someone, the first thing you're going to do is emotionally react.
Yes.
So it happens the same way in a simulator. It is during the debriefing aspect of the training.
And that's after?
That is always after the simulator session, where certain areas of feedback is provided. And that's where the learning happens. That is generally where you need to ditch the excuses, because that's the moment where you are receiving feedback of what areas were done well, what areas could be done better, or at the very least, what areas you did not perform well at all. So I think it needs to be a moment of reflection, not necessarily in the heat of the moment of whatever you're experiencing, but at some point you will need to sit back and actually think about it. What aspect of that situation should I be doing differently next time?
And does that better the individuals from your experience?
100%.
What do you notice in them if they do take on that reflective practice in the debrief after.
Well, that creates those new neural pathways. Essentially, you have created a new learnt behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So that next time you're in a very similar or exact same situation, your body and emotions don't react. You don't have the same fight or flight response that you had previously. And it might not work on the first occasion.
Of course.
Sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4 times to get there. But we're constantly learning and we're constantly evolving. But that's what needs to be done first. The stage of learning, the stage of change, which is essentially understanding that there was a part there that needed work.
Mm-hmm. And from the stories that you did share with me, I noticed that there was such a significant increase in confidence, not just in your own experience of the debrief process, because you are tested as well, but then also the people that you work with had also very much reported a increase in confidence. And isn't that such a wonderful thing to have, that if you're able to step back and be uncomfortable in that discomfort of receiving the feedback and the constructive criticism, well, from there growth happens, from there confidence happens. And if you're then able to step into really challenging situations or very emotion-driven situations, like you said, with so much more cool, calm, and collection, that's what we're trying to identify here as a benefit of actually taking ownership and ditching the excuses. Earlier today, you highlighted that by accepting that you are the common denominator, and in other words, either fully or partially responsible, essentially you're on the first step to improvement. Let's explore this a little.
Well, in a training environment, you break things down into little bite-sized bits. So essentially, if you want to look at what is the first step, at the end of the day, you are either partially or fully responsible for whatever situation you find yourself in. Accept that. That is step number one.
Mm-hmm. It does open people up to that vulnerability that then elicits curiosity, doesn't it?
Exactly. And what comes following that curiosity is that little question in your mind that says, well, if I was partially responsible for it, what could I do differently?
Doesn't that then lead to step number 2?
Exactly.
Yes.
Which is self-assess.
Mm-hmm.
Actually break it down. Come up with as many answers as you can. What was it that caused this situation? How did I get here? One example you can use with clinical work, like Klaudia says in some of the previous podcasts, is journaling. I've told people, write things down. You know, what aspect of a debriefing moment did they learn? And by writing it down, they can actually go home and just reassess just what it was that they wrote down.
Mm-hmm. It helps people reflect on the various aspects about themselves that they can then gently improve on. You know, was it the knowledge I didn't have? Was it because I didn't see something coming? Was it because I was just stuck in my own head? Were there just constant narratives going on where it prevented me from reacting in a way that could actually have been a better outcome for myself?
And in that situation, it allows you to then do a little bit of research. For example, using your support network, speaking to other people. Have you had this situation happen to you in the past? Speaking to friends, speaking to family, seeking professional help. For example, if you have an instructor or a trainer, or in the field of psychology, sitting down with a professional clinician. These are areas of self-assessing, which is going to get you to step number 3.
Mm-hmm. And the deeper you can go into asking yourself the questions, the more profound the change will be, and then the easier the step to those changes is going to be. So let's talk about step number 3.
Well, I had a situation myself, to give you an example, where it took me almost 6 months of self-assessing.
Wow.
Before I could actually get to step number 3, which is trial and error.
So so let's just stop there for a sec. We don't want to rush through these steps. We're not just saying, shoot through them very, very quickly. Give yourself the time. ask yourself those questions, come back to it. You're naturally going to be writing things down and self-reflecting in so many different states or versions of you. When you're then going back to reread some of those entries in your journal or wherever you might keep some of those logs, you're going to have a different take on it every single time. So that's a really, really good point, that it doesn't have to happen really quickly.
Well, the reason why it doesn't happen quickly most of the time is because the way we learn as humans is we have a really sharp increase in the learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
And then we all reach a certain point where we plateau or even at times dip under.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perfectly normal. So when you are trying to learn or at the very least change habits, expect that there will be a moment where you plateau.
Mm-hmm.
So it will take time, and not every situation can be an overnight success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But step number 3 leads you to trial and error, essentially discovering little bits and pieces which you can apply to your every day-to-day life or whatever situation it is that you're trying to impact change on. By making those small changes, taking a step back and assessing, did that actually work? Did that make a change? If not, that's fine. Go back to the drawing board. Have a look at other areas where you can change, other little tweaks that you can make. Get feedback from people. Speak to your support networks and find out, is it actually working? It's that trial and error which is actually going to give you that end result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like I said earlier at the beginning of this podcast, this is something I've been doing for a very long time and I'm constantly doing it. And this applies to either my professional career or my personal life. Every time I have small changes here and there, I make those small tweaks and continue to see whether I'm getting the results I want. At the end of the day, we're human. We're always evolving. We're always learning. And the best way to actually see if the evolution in yourself is working is to get back to the reassessing and then go back to making those little small trial and error applications.
Let's use an example of someone in a relationship where they're trying to go through the steps. They've taken responsibility that they've reacted a certain way or done something. They've stopped and reflected and self-assessed as to what may have happened, and now they're applying the trial and error. I regularly encourage clients from a clinical perspective to not get stuck in, but why should I? They should be doing it too. It's so easy for us to want the other person to make the changes first without then actually starting for our own benefit. And I think it's so important to not get stuck in just waiting around for everybody else to take that responsibility. It starts with us. And if you're able to communicate with the people around you, whether it be platonic friends or romantic partners, where you're all taking that ownership, there's change happening profoundly within everybody around you.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
To quote Jordan Peterson, clean your room. Essentially, you make the change. And we're trying to motivate everyone else to make the change. And if we're all making change and we're all making small bits of changes here or there, what you're going to see is the collective.
Absolutely.
So you're right, in a relationship, you don't always want to be the one that's making the change. But that's when communication comes into play.
Yes.
Have that conversation, talk about the changes you're applying, and try to motivate your partner to do the same.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you do step number 2 really well, where you're self-assessing, you're stepping into that communication without being forceful on the other person, it's actually already knowing what you can already make changes to, which, like we've identified previously, it completely diffuses the situation. You're going into that dynamic owning what is yours to own, and you're taking that responsibility, meaning that the other person is more likely to step into that space in a really safe and respectful manner. And of course, it's not always that way. And if you do find that you're unable to achieve that within your relationship dynamics, that's where you can go seek some support, whether it be from friends or family or professionals or even couple counselors that will then help create a very safe space for that communication to maybe start, and then you're both able to then mimic or model that later down the track once you've learnt those skills. Because I know it's hard, especially when you're trialing things for the first time. That trial and error needs to happen regularly, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Mm-hmm. Additionally to what we've spoken about, and I think Greg has already, I guess, highlighted this, my point is always to elevate your company. So how to practice ditching excuses and taking responsibility. The how, well, who are you surrounding yourself with? If you're surrounding yourself with individuals who are constantly negative, constantly blaming everything and everybody else, not really growing within themselves, that is what's going to be your narrative and your inner dialogue as well. So elevate your company. Seek mentors, seek connections with people that know more than you, that are going to challenge you, that are going to push you for your own growth. And I think it speaks so true with even just from your background, my background. We grew up with certain people around us and it was phenomenal for the time. But if we stayed within those relationships, whether they be romantic or platonic, naturally that would have kept us quite stuck and not growing into the people that we have become today.
Yes, I do agree with that. Exactly. You are a product of your environment at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So in today's episode, we have explored excuses. We have talked about the ego, consequences of not, I guess, taking responsibility and using excuses. We've explored the hard truths and hard pills to swallow for some of us. What it actually sounds like and looks like to take ownership and responsibility, and the how to do the work, how to actually ditch the excuses and take responsibility. That is a lot. Or at least what I want to highlight is, as we are getting everybody to be self-reflective and take ownership, we want to encourage that being done in a very kind and gentle way. To grow, we have to come at it with nurturance, because if we come at it with serious critique and ripping ourselves apart, all that's going to do is diminish your self-worth, self-esteem, and confidence. And the approach and the steps that we have shared today, we want to teach you to then do it in a very kind and gentle way for yourself, because then that will instill confidence, that will instill that power for change, and you as an individual will then grow over time.
At the end of the day, we are human. We do make mistakes. So be gentle and be vulnerable in the situation that you find yourself. And that's going to help you grow. And that's going to help you continue to live this human experience that you're living in a really, really great way.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Greg. Welcome to the Self-Reflections podcast as our first guest appearance.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Klaudia.
If you would like to see Greg in a future episode, please comment below. If there are any topics you would like us to discuss, again, comment below. Share your experiences of how the things we discussed today have been helpful, how you're maybe finding yourself stuck in some of the things we may have explored. And as always, share your experiences to add to our community. Thank you for joining us. It is an absolute pleasure. Welcome to the Self-Reflections podcast. I'm your host, Klaudia Gebert, and with me today is Greg.